welcome to ATV, our weekly special program. Today we are going to talk about Africa-related issues because the African Union Assembly undertaken in Addis Ababa before a couple of days. So in connection with that, I met Ambassador Dr. Abdul Fattah Musa. He is a Commissioner Political Affairs, Peace and Security for ECOWAS. We are going to talk about the peace and the security situation in West Africa, especially the activities and the measures they have undertaken, especially in fighting unconstitutional changes of government and other AU-related topics. Please do stay with us. I am Wagayo with the program. Thank you very much, Doctor, for your time and for your willingness for an exclusive interview with ABC.
Okay.
Well, Doctor, let me start from this question. As you have known, the AU Assembly has kicked off here in Addis Ababa early this morning. In connection with that, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia, Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of United Nations, and other high-ranking officials have addressed a keynote speech. So what's your reflection based on the speech that made early this morning?
Yes, you have to look at the theme of this year's summit, right? The 36th Ordinary Summit about accelerating African continental free trade. That is one. And a corollary to that is the strengthening of the peace and security architecture on the African continent, right? And if you look at all the refrains from this morning's session at the Assembly, let's begin with President Abiy, because Ethiopia is a symbol of what Africa wants to achieve. That is African solutions to African problems. With the help of the African Union and then the goodwill of the people of Ethiopia, President Abiy was able to bring about peace with the Tigray, TPLF, to end a war that had occupied many pages of international media for some time. Now we are not hearing about it. And this is symbolic to what we talk about, what is silencing the guns. We don't hear them. And this is exactly the symbolism of today's meeting. So it's very, very important. And you look at it, so many crises have converged on the continent today. First among them, terrorism and violent extremism, and all of them refer to it, right? The Secretary General of the United Nations repeated his call for the United Nations Security Council to fund an African force, a continental force against terrorism, with access contribution from the United Nations under Chapter 7, which has always been a problem at the Security Council. There is also the determination of the African Union to set up this force, the African Standby Force, to fight against this existential threat, which is threatening the Sahel, in Somalia, a whole lot of other places on the continent. And if we do not deal with it, then the whole idea of development, free trade, and others will be jeopardized. So the sub-regional organization, the regional economic community from where I come, like ECOWAS, is also in the process of developing a regional force against terrorism in the Sahelian region of Africa today. And so this is the refrain, to make sure that we deal with the issue of terrorism, violent extremism, and pave the way for development on the continent.
Moving to the next question, being a Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security for ECOWAS, what are activities and measures you are undertaking, especially in fighting unconstitutional changes of government, which is observed in the western parts of Africa, the place where you are living? So what are activities or measures you have undertaking and to bring about a peaceful Africa?
Like I said before, there is a convergence of threats on the continent today. You are talking about, we said, terrorism and violent extremism. You talk about the impact of climate change, flooding, and drought across the continent, intercommunal tensions that we've had all over the continent, is there, and of late, we are also seeing a reversal of the democratic gains that the continent has made over the years. In West and Central Africa alone, 4 member states are under military rule.
Yeah.
Okay, so the whole issue of unconstitutional changes, of government, unconstitutional changes of government becomes very important. About the African Union Charter on election, democracy and governance, the ECOWAS Supplementary Protocol on democracy and good governance now have to come to play. These are some of the challenges. We are fighting terrorism on the other hand, and we also want to make sure that there are no further reversals and that those countries that are under military rule transit very rapidly to constitutional order within the foreseeable future. And this is actually the focus of what we are doing. And also to do that and to prevent future unconstitutional changes, we are also strengthening our normative instruments on the continent. For example, West Africa is undertaking a review of its supplementary protocol on democracy and good governance in order to strengthen what is the democratic principles and also the sanctions regime against unconstitutional changes of government.
What shall we expect from this summit? What's expected from the leaders and heads of states of Africa to bring about a peaceful Africa that is suitable for its billions of citizens?
I think there is increasingly a convergence of views that Africa cannot depend upon the outside world for its economic growth, for its peace and security, and that everything must begin from the continent. So there is that growing belief among the African leaders. The most important thing is actually to transform it into political will, which I think forums like this bring about. And one of them is about how are we in the coming year, we are going to increase the, trade among African countries rather than trade with countries outside the continent. Trade among African countries today constitutes just about 17%. And the continent contributes to global trade at the rate of only 12%. How do we reverse these negative trends? It's about removing those barriers, both tariff and non-tariff barriers that affect intra-African trade, so that we can boost it. We've got what to produce. The continent, pound by pound, for pound, is about the richest continent on the world, the most endowed. So we have to add value to them and then to try to liberate the productive powers, the creative genius of the African citizen in order to bring this about. That is on the question of trade. The other is for us to put our money where our mouth is. If we are going to set up forces on the continent to fight terrorism, then we need also to provide them with adequate resources, whether in terms of non-voluntary contributions towards a budget for counter-terrorism on the continent, and also for the acquisition of enablers in the fight against terrorism and all that. There has to be that political will for Africa to take the lead. Then anything we get from outside in support of this process will be a bonus. But if we don't depend upon ourselves, then we cannot overcome the challenges.
What's your reflection regarding the Agenda 2063 and African Continental Free Trade Area, especially to bring a prosperous Africa for the upcoming generation?
We are already in the, the 10th decade. This is 2023. 2063 is just about 40 years. What we have observed is that the continent has broken its flagship projects. Gradual movement toward the achievement of Agenda 2063 into decades, right? This is the second decade, of the Agenda 2063. And the most important thing to underpin the achievement of that, number one, is infrastructure development on the continent, which has to be accelerated. And then how do we give value to the most valuable asset of the continent, the young people? The young people are very productive, very energetic, they have a lot of enthusiasm, they constitute 60 to 70% of the population of the continent. If we are able to integrate them productively, then they will form the engine of growth for the continent. So the infrastructure development, including education, and not just education like parroting, books and other things, but transformative education. Education that helps to transform with science, with technology and all that. And the young people are really, adept, to those, and how do we capitalize on it to make our young people productive citizens and not cannon fodder for nefarious actions like nefarious politicians, terrorists and others. It's very important. And how do we also empower women? For women, 50% of the population of the continent, if you do not raise them to the level of men in terms of decision-making, economic power, then we are not going to achieve the Agenda 2063. So those are commitments that I've heard today during the meeting: the youth, the women, infrastructure development, and first and foremost, stabilizing the continent in terms of security. And it goes also to the issue of trade. You cannot have trade when, because of crisis, because of war, borders are shut down, people cannot move. We need to have free movement in the continent. It's very, very important to release the productive capacities of our people. There are so many non-tariff barriers, border checkpoints, harassment of women, collection of bribes of our traders, and also bringing our informal trade into the formal sector, because that also constitutes a large chunk of African economy that is not actually captured in terms of the African GDP and then all that. So we need to develop all these factors and also move towards adding value to the product that we produce. We cannot continue exporting raw materials all the time. And so in our trade relations, I think emphasis should be put on adding value, and they're creating value chains, on the continent, linking countries together, regions together, under the objectives of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and all that. And they're removing the barriers, as I talked to you about. And these are some of the concrete steps that we have to take if we have to achieve, the trade that we want, the continental, free trade area. And it must also be premised on a peaceful continent, and which is also very important. And in that regard, the example that Ethiopia has just demonstrated to the world becomes very important. What also happened in Mozambique, with the fight against Al-Shabaab there, in Somalia, shows what Africa can do if we develop the political will. And this is what we have to strengthen on the continent.
All right, you are a Ghanaian and you have stayed here in Addis Ababa for this summit, and I would like to hear finally your reflection regarding the hospitality of the people, the hotels, the weather and other things. So how do you see Addis Ababa? How do you see Ethiopia in general?
I was in Ethiopia in 2014 and 2016. I was here. When I came back here 2 days ago, I saw the country had changed dramatically in terms of development, in terms of infrastructure, and how peaceful the place is. In fact, I'm very hospitable people. Ethiopia has always been. And today, when we were moving from the hotel, to the meeting hall, I saw a stark difference in that there were no many obstructions on the way. no stopping of traffic and other thing. Everything went very smoothly. So we really thank Prime Minister Abiy, the people of Ethiopia, for the hospitality and for the facilities put at our disposal.
I really appreciate it, Doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Well, viewers, this concludes my brief stay I have had with Ambassador Abdel Fattah Musa, who is a Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security for ECOWAS. We have raised very critical topics, African Union-related topics, and the peace and the security situation in the west of Africa. This concludes my program for today. Until I come yet with another topic and issue next time, have a nice time. Please do stay with other programs of ETV. I am Ogayo Mulunda. Thank you.
Africa is the second largest continent with a population of more than 1.4 billion. But what is the Africa that we want?
An Africa that's free of civil war and corruption.
An Africa that is resilient.
An Africa that has citizens who are proud of being an African.
An Africa that is free from hunger.
An Africa that is self-sufficient and prosperous.
That is the Africa we want. And these are the stories ETV will bring to you.
Thank you very much, Baba Tunde, for that introduction. Very good morning to all of you. Thank you for coming. I'm going to make a few remarks and take your question. I understand we have only 30 minutes, so we need to keep it short to the point so we can get as many questions as possible. I am aware that some of the speakers actually are French speakers. So if you want to ask your question in French, feel free to do so. If you do it in Amharic, I can't answer it because I don't speak Amharic. Let me just say a few words about, you may have heard yesterday at the Assembly, the President of Senegal talking about how climate change and disaster management is extremely important for Africa. So what it says at the political level, our heads of states are recognizing the importance of the problem and want to fix this from a political perspective and eventually come up with some solution to addressing climate change. Some of you, or many of you, have been to COP27, which was hosted in Africa for the first time in Egypt, actually the second time in Africa. And Africans have raised their concerns with regard to the importance of loss and damages, because even though we contribute less to climate change, Africa unfortunately is suffering from the effect of climate change. So therefore, Africa has been voicing its opinion and concerns, and it's really a timely moment to have this press briefing in terms of what happened after COP27. Now, you may have also seen that extreme weather conditions are affecting the continent. If you don't believe me, listen to what happened in South Africa with flooding, the flooding in Nigeria, the flooding in Niger, and all these disasters, unfortunately, have a huge impact on the human conditions of our people, particularly the most vulnerable people, with regard to food security, in some cases actually losing life and livelihood. So therefore, this matter is not just a matter of development, it's also a matter of the life of our people. And that is why it is extremely important that we're briefing you on this topic. What I want to focus on is the big picture in terms of what the AU is doing about this. And then second, we as an institution of the AU, where do we fit within that strategy of the AU, not only in terms of achievement, but also in terms of ambition, and then get your questions. Now, the AU has come up with what they call an Africa Regional Disaster Reduction Strategy, and that is the strategy that guides the intervention of the AU when it comes to disaster risk management and reduction. So therefore, from a political perspective, from a commitment perspective, AU has come up with a strategy that guides all of us, our intervention across the board, and that is extremely critical because that strategy shape the directions and also what we do on behalf of our member states. With regard to our organization, building from that strategy, we focus on three aspects of disaster risk management, extremely important for all of our countries. Number one, helping our countries to plan better in dealing with disasters. Unfortunately, these disasters, if you don't actually plan appropriately, by the time they arrive, it may be too late. So it is critical that we help our countries to plan better, anticipate before disaster happens, because if you wait till it happens, it may be too late. And the type of disaster we're talking about are known to all of us is drought, which lead to food security, which is quite relevant in the Horn of Africa. We're talking about flood, which is quite relevant to most of our countries, too much water. And we talk about tropical cyclone, which is relevant to Madagascar and Mozambique, another country in the Indian Ocean region. And then recently, as you may have seen, we also talk about outbreak and epidemic, which is extremely important. So the first intervention we do as an organization in making sure our countries profile their risk, understand the exposure to disaster so they can make a decision as the government. Now, second, we also help our countries to prepare themselves for disasters. I'm sure most of you understand in most of our countries, the problem with disaster management, the responsibility lies in different ministries, different government entities, and unfortunately, any lack of coordination can cost life and livelihood. So it is extremely critical that our government entities actually coordinate themselves. So there is an intervention that's highly coordinated, and that's why preparation is important. Last is the response to disasters. And in many countries in Africa, they're coming out what they call contingency funding, solidarity funding, and social safety net, other financial instrument that allows government to at least finance the response before you lose life. In our particular case, we're also suggesting another innovative way, and that is to go to the insurance market. And that is that if government decide to transfer the risk to the insurance market, it allows them to mobilize additional resources off their national budget to respond to disasters wherever they occur, because when disaster occur, the first 2-3 weeks is extremely critical for government to save life and livelihood. Now, what I've just described to you at ARC, it's no longer a concept, it's been tested. Since our inception 10 years ago, we provided up to $1 billion worth of coverage, all of our member states, all disasters combined. We also made a payout of $125 million to our countries when the disaster or the risk actually triggered, that allows government for the first 2 weeks of intervention is actually funded from this payout. This is extremely critical because in disasters situation, every second counts. And if you miss the right timing, you may actually lose life. Now, third, in addition to the coverage and the money that I talked about, we also protected about 100 million people across Africa. These are people that if the payout did not come on time, they may have to sell their assets to survive. In some cases, they may even lose their life. So this is extremely critical with regard to the life and livelihood of Africans. And last but not least, we also train about 1,000 people in Africa in disaster risk management capabilities and skills that they require to manage the disaster situation. This is extremely critical. Let me wrap up by just saying, going forward, what our ambitions are. As of today, ARC has about 35 member states. And now, you know, Africa is more than 35, with 55. So our ambition is to make sure that every African country become a member of ARC so we can demonstrate the leadership of Africa in dealing with disaster risk management. Second, disaster does not mean the same thing to all of our countries. In other words, drought may be prevalent in the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel. It may not be the case in other countries. So we want to diversify the product that we offer to our member states from drought, tropical cyclone, outbreak and epidemic, and flood to make sure we can address the relevant disasters affecting our member states. Going forward also, we need to amplify the African voice and concerns at COP28. It is extremely critical for Africans to be fully coordinated. So when they go to this big event, the African voice and concerns are heard loud and clear, and we will definitely utilize our experience as a convening power and make sure the African voice is actually coordinated. Last but not least, equally important, and that is gender. most of our countries, the most vulnerable people affected by disaster happen to be women. So therefore, if you're serious about disaster management, gender should be taken very, very, very seriously. So we hope with our action, we can demonstrate to our member state, disaster doesn't have to kill. If you plan better and prepare yourself, you can respond appropriately. Let me stop there and take any question that you may have. Thank you.